It's all the same. There's a pink one and a green one and a blue one and a yellow one. They're ticky tacky. They all look just the same. All right, folks, welcome. Little musical intro per my example there. And microphone on, go. Hi, welcome. This is my example of our ELDOR mini project for this week. And Little Boxes by Malvina Reynolds is the intro song, which I usually play during this lesson in class. And some of you who know the Showtime series Weeds might recognize that as the theme song. That was my introduction to it. And a little side fact, during all this binging of shows that we're all doing right now, I think Weeds, when I lived abroad in Norway in 2007, that might have been the first show that I officially binged. And no, there was not streamable Netflix or streamable anything. We either had to buy the DVDs that came out after a show had aired to binge a show, or, which I think I did for other shows, but for Weeds, I binged through some sketchy online, Korean video internet site that I think has long since been removed due to copyright infringement. But I digress. Little boxes on the hillside, little boxes all the same. During the 1950s, the United States was going through this economic boom that was the result of our economic war machine turning from producing tanks to all of a sudden making right on the American dream promise and allowing people to buy their first homes. This is a lot of to do with the GI Bill and soldiers coming back from war, and really kind of the creation of the American suburb as we know today is this interesting piece between the country, between metropolitan living in the city. So we're going to take a look at suburbanization today and how, for any of you who watched Mr. Lee's example, that was obviously zoomed very out and talking about the Cold War as a macro or global phenomenon of our ELDOR, American values during the 1950s. My example is going to zoom in and take a look at the domestic at-home experience for the average American and what American values and the American dream looked like in the 1950s. So my guiding questions for these slides that I'll go through today and the research that I did are: which American values, ELDOR, not economics, equality, liberty, democracy, opportunity, and rights. These are the guiding 5 values of this, our History Alive textbook. How did ELDOR, which of the ELDOR, maybe you'll see more than the 5, influence the political, economic, and social forces that anchored American culture of the 1950s? And for many, created an American ideal that some people today are drawing upon to create a vision of what America ideally could look like. And then at the same time, what of those forces do you imagine could have been reasons or causes for division all the while in the United States? So, world's highest standard of living as it was boasted in the 1950s. There's no way like the American way, is what that says underneath my little screen there. The affluent society. So what made America great in the first place? I alluded to it on my last slide, but many of the MAGA hat wearing folks today call upon making America great again and hearkening back to an age like the 1950s, like the birth of our economic prosperity coming out of World War II, and how beneficial that was for some Americans. So I know I'll just model what the C means matters would be that we'd otherwise do. I see upper middle class, white family. They're all really into hats, apparently. I guess that was the fashion standard of the day. but we're driving a car. This is the era that the interstate is created and really starts to stitch together America and American prosperity. And this is kind of the second and a half, almost third generation of American car drivers and the status symbol of owning a car. Just like we talked about at the beginning of the year, owning a car and owning a home and being able to save up money and afford a college education, these become part of those stereotypical American standards that for some look like the master narrative that can be unattainable, unreachable, oppressive. For others, it becomes an anchored standard of the American dream. So this generation of babies, 76 million children born in the 18 to 20 years of this generation, immediately following the war and up through the early 60s, is known as the baby boomers. Undoubtedly, you've heard that word before. Certainly, you know the meme, okay, boomer. So this is referring obviously to those out of date old heads. This is like my parents' generation. My dad comes from a family of 8, all of whom were born between 1946 and 1963. So all squarely baby boomers. My war-serving grandfather came back from the war and they had kids. That was part of what they did. And as I mentioned, the little boxes on the hillside. So this is a picture of the first Levittown that emerged up. A man by the name of William Levitt kind of conceived of the first American suburb and cul-de-sac and what became known as these tract houses that were built and just sort of built to a same spec template, and everybody's house looked like everybody's house. And you created these large suburban on the outside of the urban or metropolitan area neighborhood. And they were cheap to produce. They became kind of derided and made fun of as cheap looking eventually, but they were easy to produce and they were really easy to afford. And so with a $90 down payment and with a mortgage of a mere $58 a month, you could become a homeowner. And this investment in equity, as it became an opportunity for Americans, was a huge part of expanding the American economy and the stability of people's home ownership. You see another shot here of another Levittown and some of these tract homes that were built. So this era of suburbanization begins, and it describes, this word will be used to describe a trend of city dwellers moving from the cities into these residential areas in these growing concentric circles that are away from the city's core. So I often like to use the example of the ripple in the pond. You throw the rock in the pond and that's sort of your city center, and then the ripples that move outward become your different concentric circles of suburbs. This trend explodes in the 1950s, and really the phenomenon that many of you are familiar with, that we've experienced in Seattle and other metropolitan areas, has been gentrification, which has been the opposite, has been sort of the pendulum swinging back the other way. So wealthier, upper middle class, often white people who grew up in the suburbs have moved back into metropolitan areas in the city and have driven out people of color who lived in cities where throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s were cheaper places to live and were often less desirable. And so now this swing of one generation in the suburbs, another generation coming back into the metropolitan area. So suburbanization begets eventually gentrification, which is likely a term that you're familiar with. So consumerism is a big part of the American economy during this time. I'll move my thing here as if I were really going through the slideshow. I love this advertisement and usually have a fun time asking students to recognize and point out some of the brands that are still with us today. So we see sports brands like Wilson or Wheaties or the Johnson motor here, and then some brands that, maybe Oscar Mayer here, but some brands that didn't quite make it. But I just love that this painting of this idyllic afternoon with just a ridiculous amount of food for four people. And like you brought your lawnmower on your day at the beach, and we have just a spare motor for the boat. I don't know. It's really meant to be more of a commentary on American consumerism than it is an actual kind of painting. But everything is branded, everything is shiny and neat and new, and everybody is very kempt and very coiffed for their day at the lake. And again, this all white American, presumably middle class family, and what the affordability of this kind of leisure would look like. So other major points about the economy during this time that are worth noting. Credit cards as a concept are introduced in the 1950s. So starting to buy on credit again in, for those of you who had just remembered studying the 1920s, you remember the problem that we had of buying stocks on credit and how buying on the margins and buying with credit led to a big part of the economic downturn and the Great Depression. Individual companies start to offer and create credit cards as a way for people to buy goods and pay back the full amount across a certain amount of time and charge interest. And this was not only a nice way to get people to invest in things like a really expensive oven or stove or TV or radio or boat here, but then you started to create incentives, and companies like this still today, you know, Nordstrom comes to mind. You built customer service and lifelong customers on these sort of rewards and credit programs. So that really begins in the 1950s. The American economy grows 37% in the 1950s, and the gross domestic product, or the GDP, doubles in the baby boomer generation. So the American economy is not only, you know, hyped up on steroids and working, but it is effective. So average incomes grow 70% in that decade. And for those of you who remember the height of spending and growing in the interwar periods in the 1920s, you see that the average American has twice the spending power that they had even in the 1920s. So by 1955, the United States, with only 6% of the world's population at that time, was producing almost half of the world's goods. So both you and I have grown up across the last 30, how old am I, 35? 30 years of China really dominating the cheap plastic crap that we all buy and consume, these headphones that are falling out of my ears right now. But before China got its act together, the US had really cornered the market for about close to 50 years on being the main driver of consumer goods for the global market. I'll finish on one final point about what drove consumerism. And since I always like to talk in my class about the influence of media, so just like we had to the 20s was radio and the advent that shaped that generation, then this generation who was starting to have children, their children were greatly influenced by the advent and the introduction of the television. So just for example of its ubiquity, not unlike smartphones that have a similar arc of adoption in 1950, fewer than 1 in 10 households, 8.7% of households had one TV. But by just 10 years later, 9 of every 10 households had at least a TV in their homes. So let's bring that to my final reflection questions again. Which American values, ELDOR, influenced the political, economic, or social forces that anchored American culture in the 1950s? To me, this seems to speak to opportunity, the economic opportunity that the average American had, coupled with some of the individual choices and liberty that people had to spend their money and invest it and grow the economy, was kind of a lot of trust that the the American public had in each other to kind of drive this engine forward. And something that we're all trying to think about again in this time right now, like as we're starting to see economies peak around the corner and kind of open back up, wondering what is it going to take for us to have trust in this economy as we rebuild from a different crisis of our own. It has not been a world war, but something close to it. And what forces do you imagine could have been the reasons or causes for division at this time? And so then for that ELDOR value, I like to come to equality. And we know that what's right around the corner for us to explore and study is the civil rights movement. And for whom was this not the rosy colored ideal looking America? Where could African Americans afford to live? Who was being given that application for that credit card at the Macy's layaway, get your new chrome plated stovetop? Racial bias and racism played a huge role in the shaping of the economy moving forward. And this is the same era where we start to see really firm laws around redlining emerge. So if you wanted to stick around and meet a lecture for an hour, that would be the second half of this slideshow, is taking a look at for whom was America not so great during this time. But I'll leave that open to some of you as a possible topic to explore. I hope you've enjoyed my example of an ELDOR look into suburbanization in America in the 1950s. Peace. Oh yeah, like and subscribe and do all the things. And